Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft, did not get stuck in a bathtub. It's very unfortunate. I know that I, and most likely you, really wanted the big boy president to have gotten stuck at the White House, although that didn't happen, unfortunately. That just started circling way after his death. It's unfortunate that it didn't happen, believe me. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 21st President of the United States, Chester Arthur, while holding many political offices before becoming President of the United States, he was only elected to one office in his entire life, and that was the Vice Presidency of the United States. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In 1841, following the death of William Henry Harrison, President John Tyler vetoed a national bank, which was a core policy of his party, the Whig Party. And this makes sense, actually, because John Tyler was a Democrat. He was elected as a Whig, but he considered himself a Democrat. The vetoing of the national bank led to him being kicked out of the Whig Party, and he spent the remainder of his term independent, without a party. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Within the month that Harry Truman had served as vice president under Franklin Roosevelt, the pair had only spoken twice. That's why Truman felt odd going to the White House in April of 1945, when Eleanor Roosevelt told Harry Truman that the president had died.
Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In light of my prime minister resigning today, I think I should preface this presidential fact by saying that Richard Nixon, the 37th president, is the only one to have resigned in America. I know it's pretty boring, but you're gonna get one tomorrow, so calm down.
Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Millard Fillmore, who served as president from 1850 to 1853, ran for president in 1856 for the Know Nothing Party, because his party, the Whigs, had collapsed by that point. However, he didn't know he was nominated. In fact, he was in Europe when he received the nomination letter. Interesting. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The president that I made a video about recently, William Howard Taft, met with the Mexican president because of the Mexican Revolution. It was the first meeting between an American and a Mexican president. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 21st President of the United States, Chester Arthur, was known for owning over 80 pairs of pants and would frequently change them during the day. It was kinda crazy. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Every single letter in the alphabet can be found in a presidential name. Yes, even some of the weirder letters that you wouldn't expect, like Q in John Quincy Adams, or Z in Zachary Taylor, X in James Polk. Well, James Knox Polk, but it's still there. So yeah, every letter is in. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In the 8 years that George Washington served as president, well, it wasn't exactly 8, but we'll probably get to that in a different video, the United States recognized over 20 independent countries. But of those 20, only 8 still exist today. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The Democratic Party, well, it still exists, but it didn't for a long time. It was created in the 1830s, and most of the people who represented the Democratic Party and also served as president didn't have much luck when it came to children. The creator of the party, Andrew Jackson, had no biological children. His successor, Martin Van Buren, did have a couple. James Polk didn't have any children, and Franklin Pierce had all of them die before the age of 12. Oh, and the guy after that, James Buchanan, was probably gay. Yeah. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. George Washington may have led troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. However, the fourth president, James Madison, was the only one to lead troops in an active war, the War of 1812. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President Jimmy Carter was the first president to be sworn in not using his real name, which would have been James Earl Carter. He was sworn in his inauguration in 1977 under Jimmy Carter, if you can believe that. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Abraham Lincoln is probably your favorite president. He's number one amongst historians, but being born in Kentucky, he was the first president not to be born in the original 13 colonies. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Did you know that Dr. Robotnik, also known as Dr. Eggman from the Sonic games, was originally going to be the main character? Yeah, not Sonic. That's because his design was based off of President Theodore Roosevelt. Yeah, Sega thought that there would be an appeal to play as president, although they ended up scrapping the idea because, well, they thought many kids wouldn't know who Theodore Roosevelt is. That's a shame. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In the 1988 election, eventual winner George H.W. Bush, as late as June, was polling 20 points behind Democratic challenger Michael Dukakis. But it ended up being a landslide, with being the last election that a candidate got over 400 electoral votes. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today, Donald Trump arrived in Washington for his inauguration. He announced a couple days ago that he will be holding his inauguration swearing-in ceremony inside. It's the first inauguration in 40 years to have been doing so since Ronald Reagan on the coldest inauguration day in history back in 1985. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. You know how when the president gets sworn in and they say, "I do solemnly swear"? Well, that's because they are swearing on the Bible. They're swearing the oath of office. However, not every president did that. 14th President Franklin Pierce affirmed the oath of office, and instead of placing his hand on the Bible, he placed his hand on a constitutional law book. Interesting. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today's inauguration day. Let's forget about political beliefs for a second here. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first term was actually pretty short when you compare other one-term, or any term really, because he was inaugurated on March 4th, like most presidents. But in the mid of his term, they passed a constitutional amendment which required the president to be sworn in today, on the 20th of January. So his first term was March 4th, 1933 to January 20th, 1937. Interesting. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When Abraham Lincoln was sworn in for the second time in March of 1865, was before the South surrendered. He gave the shortest inauguration speech, or one of the shortest, maybe not the shortest, I think that was Washington, but he gave one of the shorter inauguration addresses. But that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to tell you, just a couple of feet behind him, so not too far at all, was John Wilkes Booth, a man who, a month later, would shoot him in the back of the head. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. During his inauguration a couple of days ago, Donald Trump actually failed to place his hand on the Bible when getting sworn in, which means that he technically joins presidents like John Quincy Adams and Franklin Pierce to have not sworn in on the Bible, because Trump sworn in, I guess, on the air? Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. By the time you're seeing this, Joe Biden's post-presidency is about, 3 days. And that would be the shortest in American presidential history if he were to die in about a minute. However, it's the shortest post-presidency that ended amongst the president's death would be James Polk, who died just over 100 days after leaving office in 1849. Hello, I'm Dazod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When the 32nd president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wed his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, no name change was needed. That was because Eleanor Roosevelt's last name was Roosevelt, because Eleanor and Franklin were sixth cousins. In fact, Franklin and Theodore Roosevelt were fifth cousins. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 3 American presidents have passed away on the 4th of July. James Monroe in 1831, and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson on the same day, the 50th anniversary of the country, July 4th, 1826. However, only one president, and actually vice president as well, was born on the 4th of July, and both of those people would be Calvin Coolidge, who is my personal favorite president. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 15th President James Buchanan never married, so while he served as president, the First Lady was his niece, Harriet Lane. She actually served as a very popular First Lady, whilst Buchanan wasn't a very popular president. In fact, there's actually a ship out there still in use named the USS Harriet Lane after the former First Lady. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. I'm off to write my first exam. Yeah, that statement probably hasn't been said so enthusiastically since Millard Fillmore married his teacher in 1826. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Commencing with Andrew Jackson and ending with Calvin Coolidge, every president within that time frame failed to make it to the age of 80. And that's actually surprising if you look at the older presidents like John Adams, who lived to 90, Thomas Jefferson to 83, and so on. And Herbert Hoover broke that curse, reaching 90. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Despite what some Theodore Roosevelt fanboys might suggest, the birthday boy, William McKinley, was the first president to have ever rode in a car. In fact, that's how he got to the hospital. He rode in an ambulance. The former governor of Ohio and Rutherford B. Hayes campaign staffer did not enjoy the ride. He claimed that, the people inside the car are at risk of getting blown up to bits, and the driver could easily lose control. Yeah, the former isn't so likely, but the latter is still a problem that we suffer with today. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 12th president, Zachary Taylor, was a lifelong independent and a lifelong mystery man. In fact, when he was running for president, very few actually knew what they would be voting for if they voted the Whig Party. Well, in fact, it would be Zachary Taylor who they would be voting for, but I guess they just didn't know that. But anyways, Zachary Taylor was so independent, he never actually voted in a presidential election, even once. In fact, he didn't vote in any election until 1846. Wow, Zachary. I know the military is kind of rough, but you're allowed to vote. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Did you know that 7 people who served as President of the United States got electoral votes in 3 separate elections? Let's see if I can remember them all off the top of my head. Thomas Jefferson, he received electoral votes in 3 different elections. Andrew Jackson, because he felt like 1824 was, not very fair. It was the original election fraud, whatever. Next up was Grover Cleveland when he won back-to-back, or not back-to-back. That's the whole point about Cleveland. He didn't get back-to-back terms. Franklin Roosevelt was the next one, and he won 3 straight terms. That's something interesting about him. Richard Nixon, of course, got 3 electoral votes in 3 different elections. Ronald Reagan, which might surprise some folks, but in 1976, he received a faithless elector from an elector in Washington. So there you go, Reagan, you're on this list. And of course, most recently, Donald Trump got electoral votes in 3 separate elections.